Hello, sword people. Welcome to the Sword Guy podcast. This is your host, Dr. Guy Windsor, consulting swordsman, teacher, and writer. Join me for interviews with historical martial arts instructors and experts from a wide range of related disciplines as we discuss swords, history, training, and bringing the joy of historical martial arts into our modern lives. I hope you enjoy this greatest hit episode of the show. You can find all the episodes at swordschool.com/podcast, and there's a direct link in the description to this episode's show notes. On with the show.
I'm here today with Dr. Antti Ijäs, whose recent doctoral dissertation is a scholarly examination of Royal Armouries manuscript 133, and includes, again this is just an appendix, just something he had to do to keep his notes in order, a complete transcription and translation of the entire manuscript. But that's just the appendix. Right, so without further ado, Antti, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm guessing you're in Helsinki, correct?
Yes, that is true. I am in Helsinki, in the capital of Finland, currently in my home study.
Excellent. And Helsinki is basically my hometown. That's what when I think hometown, it's Helsinki. So while I lived in Helsinki, I don't think we ever met, did we?
No, I don't think so. We've exchanged a few emails once or something, and I actually saw you at a FinCon convention, but that must have been in Jyväskylä, I think, and that was like 20 plus years ago.
Yeah, so that was FinCon 2001 in Jyväskylä.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the year I moved to Finland. I remember it really clearly.
Okay.
Okay, so how did you get into historical martial arts?
Well, I mean, if I go to if I ignore having watched relevant movies and stuff like that, the first thing that comes to mind is around year 2000, I was reading a martial arts book by Keith Kanspecht on Wing Chun mostly, but it also included this chapter on the history of martial arts, and he also refers there to several of these older German books. Among them, there were illustrations from Albrecht Dürer's Hoplodidaskalia and Swetnam School of Arms and Joachim Meyer, and also Jakob Happel's book from 1865. And at the time, I simply thought that, oh, this is something very interesting, because, of course, he had picked some images showing weapons similar to those used in Wing Chun for obvious reasons.
Of course,
but being already interested in older literature and languages at the time, I was enthralled by these images. But at the time, I had no means to pursue this any further. Besides, I did quite a lot of reading at the local bookstore. I remember Sidney Anglo's Martial Arts of Renaissance Europe, for example. There in Akateeminen Kirjakauppa, which used to be pretty good in the old days.
It used to be.
Yeah.
But it has always been very expensive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then in 2001 was actually the first time I did some relevant training. That was in Denmark. And that was the European Historical Combat Guild, so it's a bit different from anything that I do today. Actually,
I have a vague recollection of them.
Yeah, it's based on late John Waller's teachings.
Right. Okay. Yeah, So primarily stage combating.
Yeah. So based kind of a system based off his ideas of stage combat, which is. Quite interesting in its own right, I must say.
Sure.
But anyway, then, of course, like I said, I didn't really have the means at the time to pursue this interest further, doing my other martial arts business, of course, training Wing Chun and Eskrima at the time. But one of my Danish instructors eventually did get me to sort of start actively training with these kinds of weapons, and Lars Lind from Copenhagen, and I've also done quite a lot of training with Konrad Kessler from Germany.
Okay.
And
can I just say that all this time I was right there in Helsinki, and you could have just showed up.
Yeah, I mean, what are you going to do? You know,
I know. You got to do it the hard way, right?
yeah, things go the way they go. And nowadays, I'm teaching a small group at our club as a kind of a part of Lars Lind's weapons combat systems thing, and then I train with Grisvart group. So training with a group of friends and teaching a small group in historical martial arts. That's basically.
So, what's your group called?
Grisvart. It's run by Joeli Takala.
Oh, it's Joeli. Oh, yeah. Joeli was a student of mine for a very long time.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're part of Joeli's crew now. Excellent.
Yeah. We have a lot of fun.
That in martial arts terms, that makes you my grandchild. Do you realise?
Yeah, I suppose if we want to go for this Finnish thing.
Yeah. I'm honestly, I'm not a fan, so don't worry.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did you come across the manuscript, Royal Armouries Manuscript 133?
Well, originally, I suppose, somewhere on the internet, in the early days.
I think Anglo mentions it in.
Martial Arts Around Europe. He talks about it in his book, and there are some quite nice facsimiles there, a few pages, and some notes on the technical terms and how 133 goes about communicating technique and so forth. But of course, I suppose I did find around that time also something on the internet, some early transcriptions or whatnot. But yeah. So that's, I mean, I've known the manuscript as such for a long time, so I can't really pinpoint the exact moment I came to know.
No. I don't mean the exact moment you first saw it. I mean the moment when you thought, I'm going to spend years of my life getting incredibly nerdy about this particular book.
Okay. Well, that's perhaps a more interesting story, actually, because at the time I actually majored in English philology, specializing in Old English, Anglo-Saxon related stuff. But then, because of some reasons, I was sort of prevented from doing what I wanted to do for my PhD at the time within that realm of knowledge. So I decided to go for Latin language, because at the time I had also done Latin and Greek, both the whole thing, the advanced studies, which I suppose somewhere might make sense to call it like a triple major or something. Okay,
so that's English philology, Latin and Greek as a kind of triple major.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So then I sort of got this idea as I was writing something that never came to be, because I decided to do something else with it. But essentially, studying this medieval Latin manuscript, because as I said, I had been working with medieval stuff earlier anyway, so I thought this was something of a sweet spot, because it wasn't exactly like boring linguistics or translation studies or something like that, but it was more like how you communicate ideas or technique and stuff like that. Plus, it had something to do with my hobbies, having to do with martial arts and fencing and stuff. And so it felt like a good idea. And of course, this being basically the only medieval Latin fencing manuscript, it was of course the obvious choice.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
What I was a bit worried about was, of course, that at that time they had already published this French edition, and there was, of course, Geoffrey Forgang's wonderful edition at that time in the second edition already, the extraordinary one.
Yeah, the extraordinary edition. That's a good book.
Yeah, so a lot had been written on this topic, and what actually, I suppose, surprised myself and other people afterwards was that how much I eventually did find to say about this topic. Besides,
Can I just interject? Your PhD thesis is extremely long, right? When I described it as monumental, I was being absolutely literal. It is huge. And it manages to combine being huge with actually being interesting the whole way through. So I don't know quite how you did that.
Thank you. Glad to hear it, because I mean, obviously not each and every chapter is going to please each and every reader, but then again, that was not the point anyway. So, but of course, because I sort of widened my questions to not only this particular manuscript and its contents, but to cover the genre.
Yeah.
So then, of course, this whole the scope of the study sort of becomes wider and allowed me to, and I'm saying allowed me to because I really enjoyed this and I thought that this is something that will be more useful for me in the future than having just, looked at one text. So to look at this genre, not only how it sort of comes to be, around the same time when 133 was composed. I mean, I sort of take it for granted now that there existed more literature at the time and before 133.
There has to be.
Yeah. So sort of speculating on that and, well, not speculating, but making educated guesses on that, inferring things from 133. And of course, 133's position when you look at what comes later. So in a sense, how does 133 represent the corpus of literature that existed at the time, from whence all this other stuff sort of comes out of. So that became a rather interesting endeavor to find out. And of course, one of my favorite details is Giles of Rome, who slightly before, in the late 13th century, published his De Regimine Principum on the governing of princes, which is like a manual for well, as it says on the tin, a manual for princes on how to govern, and it has extensive paraphrases from Vegetius, and he also has 2 chapters on using the sword and footwork.
Really?
And this is kind of interesting when you think of Giles of Rome as being quite popular. So there are like hundreds of
in his
work.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was translated into other languages. I mean, I haven't looked at this in more detail. I mean, like the reception of his teachings in that sense, and I might in the future. But anyway, you could say tentatively that his was the most popular fight book in the medieval period, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like 2 chapters within this larger book, but it's still quite interesting.
Sure, but it's reasonable. It's reasonable to suppose that the more copies survive, the more popular the book was. That's reasonable.
Yeah. But of course, a book being popular is one thing. Individual sections having been read and studied and
is another thing altogether.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So then you'd have to go for the manuscripts and look at the marginal notes to find signs of reading, and you'd have to, try to find.
Am I sensing your next research project?
Who knows?
Yes, please do, because I want a translation.
There's a lot of stuff going on, but we can talk about that later. But of course, there is that one section where 133 refers to footwork. Yeah. That one little part where it says that you can either step forward with the left or back with the right. Yeah. Implying that you sort of stand in a position from which you would end up in the same alignment of feet, whether you pass with the left or pass with the right backward. Yeah. So this only part where 133 refers to footwork is in contrast to what Giles of Rome says, because he writes, sort of following Vegetius, that you should only move the right foot.
Ah, okay.
And I don't think that's it's a very small thing, but it doesn't feel like a coincidence. So it could be that this is something of a comment that, yes, you can actually also, move the other.
So you think the author of 133 may have read Giles?
Yeah, I mean, why not?
Why not? Yeah. Fair.
Okay. Or had been exposed to this idea because it is Vegetius or so whatever,
So basically the earliest reference to footwork, so in Giles, he's basically recommending the kind of footwork that modern sport fencers do, just with the right foot forward all the time.
No, I think what he means is that you either pass back with the right or pass forward with the right. So the left is sort of the immobile center, I think it's in Vardy's diagram. Yeah.
Yeah, the left foot is
sun and
sun and the tower. So the left foot is firm for your safety, and the right turns around it.
Yeah. I think it's something like that, and it doesn't quite fit what Vegetius says, but this is it's when you start interpreting these small technical details from a text that has a lot of ambiguity, especially the older it gets, it's always slightly difficult. So it's I'm not taking any definite stance on that yet, but so okay. Whatever I wrote in my dissertation about that, of course, you should probably check that out. But it's an interesting matter.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how these we tend to think of in the kind of wider historical martial arts community. We tend to think of 133 as the first book, right? And there's nothing really before that. But you just check on Wiktor now, and there's lots of sort of books before that. But it's 133 is like the first complete. This is all about sword fighting and nothing else. Text that you could just look at and go, yes, that's a fight book, and that's all. That is its function. So while you were doing all this sort of putting it in its wider fencing context, was there anything that particularly surprised you?
Well, I suppose what I just talked about, this amount of intertextuality that you can find in time back and forth, like we just talked about, backwards to Giles of Rome. And then also this whole structure, when you think of these 7 parts, it's this logical structure where you just divide. You cuts from below, left and right, and cuts the high cut, the vertical cut, and then from the other side, and then you've got the thrust, and then you've got the end position of all movements. That's defined. So that's kind of just a logical way of talking about fencing. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is now a system of fencing, but it's just, we want to talk about this, so let's divide it up like this. And something similar to this structure then shows up later on in Andreas Lignitzer's six Stücke of sword and buckler, where he kind of goes not in the same order, of course, but he also sort of starts from cut from the right, and there's the low cut, he calls it a changing cut, and so forth. And then there's the thrust that is very similar to how the thrust is depicted in 133. So kind of this, that you can see these traces of this intellectual effort that was apparently taken somewhere in the early 14th century, late 13th century to conceptualize fencing. So you can see these traces later on, but then you also see these like less coherent, let's say. I mean, when I say less coherent, I'm saying it's bad. I'm just saying that it's more like just putting random things in order, like the Lichtnauer's 17 Hauptstücke. It's just, things one after another. It doesn't divide the system in the same way.
Right. See, there's something that has bugged me for a long time, right? 133 is beautifully organized. Here are these 7 wards, which make sense. And then the treatise is organized. So let's have a look at first ward, and let's have a look at second ward, and let's have a look at third ward. And it just basically it's organized like that. So it has a very clear organizational structure, which is easy to follow, right? Then we have Fiore, who organizes things a little differently, but it's a very clear, very organized structure. Here's, depending on which manuscripts you look at, let's say, here's the wrestling, here's the dagger plays are organized by these 9 masters, these 9 different ways of defending. Then there's a sword in one hand, and so on it goes, right? And it's all beautifully organized. And then the Germans in the 15th century just sort of slap stuff together in this sort of like, okay, here's a bit of this and here's a bit of that. And yes, they kind of organize it vaguely according to Lichtenauer's Merkverse, the Zettel. But the treatises themselves are not these ordered, organized things. They're much more haphazard. Why is that?
I mean, it's maybe comparing apples and oranges in the sense that if you look at Fiore's book, he has collected material and explicitly organized it in order to be a presentable copy. So if you want to compare that to something, then you might compare that to like Joachim Meyer later, or Paulus Hector Meyer, or something like that, who have also sort of well collected stuff, and of course included stuff that I know and compose stuff themselves maybe. But so that's different from these individual shorter texts that we have, for example, from Antti Ijäs, whom I just mentioned, that he's got this one text on sword and buckler, 6 points. And that's also kind of, it's an organization. It has one topic, sword and buckler, and then it's organized under these 6 exercises.
Okay.
So, and I have to say, Antti Ijäs, one of my favorites in this sense, he always numbers everything. So he's kind of trying to be the organized one.
Yeah. Although he is the exception.
Yeah. and then the other shorter text, you've got this, okay, now we've got, well, I mean, the armored fencing from 4 guards, that's also organized according to 4 guards. Mm-hmm. So it's the same, in a sense, the same system as in 133, that you start from the first one, then you move on to the second, third, and the fourth. So I wouldn't say that they are completely disorganized in that sense. And of course, Lichtnauer's Merkverse, that probably has some kind of history that explains that, okay, when he compiled his system from what he had learned, that it would have made sense for him to compose his sort of verse in this way for whatever reason, for safekeeping, or, you know, as something that you need to learn to be sort of part of his secret society, so to speak, or something like that. So who knows? And of course, it does even there, it does kind of make sense that you've got all the 5 master cuts in the beginning. It's not like you've got to get one master cut and then later on, after something else, you get the second master cut and so forth. So there is some hint of organization there as well. But regarding using guards as an or wards, I mean, I don't
same word.
Same thing, different dialects. Yes, that is something we have in 133 where it makes absolutely sense. And when you think of influences or loan words in languages, wherever it can be analyzed, that's usually the loan giver. And the language in which you can't analyze a loan word, that's got the loan. Okay, so it's not the other way around. So where it makes sense, that's probably the original one. Okay. So looking at this sort of historically, in 133, the organization makes sense because it's kind of based on this division of the whole of fencing. Yeah. And then the entire book proceeds according to this division, which is very much in accordance with medieval intellectual sensibilities. And then later on, we sort of get remnants of this, that, like I said, this text on the fighting in armor from the 4 guards. And then in the Rome manuscript, the so-called von Danzig codex, it also has the 4 guards at the beginning, which is kind of like it's the only illustration in the book. So it kind of goes to say that for some reason, whoever made this manuscript thought that showing the guards in the beginning is something that you're sort of supposed to do. Right. Even though in this context it doesn't really make sense, because Lichtnauer's longsword doesn't really proceed from these different guards. Right. They are not really used for any of this. And I would argue the same goes for Fiore. He has a list of guards, and then he sort of forgets about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's kind of like he has the guards because he feels that, okay, this is how you write a fight book. You put in the guards first, then he says anything that comes to mind regarding the guards. And then he goes on listing his favorite moves that he has seen performed, or at least seen performed.
No. Okay, start.
Yeah.
No, okay. If you look at the organization of Fiore's, we're talking about the longsword material, right?
Yeah.
Yes, the guards are organized in, or are presented in a somewhat, not haphazard, but an inconsistent way, and it's not consistent across all the manuscripts, okay? Mm-hmm. So yes. Yep. But the organization of the longsword plays themselves make perfect sense. They are an exercise in basically demonstrating how. Well, firstly, they're divided into the largo plays and the strato plays. Okay. So the largo plays proceed from the crossing of the sword, where you've beaten your opponent's weapon away and you are in some degree free to strike. Okay, yep. So you have the beat it away, strike over the arms. That's the first thing. But if you have control of their sword, but you're not quite free to leave the sword to strike, you grab the blade and hit them, or grab the blade and kick them in the knee. Okay. Then we have the colpo di Villano. If the blow comes in really hard, you cover it in the same way, but moving across and let it slide off to the side, and you hit them on the other side of the blade. Okay. And you follow that up with a thrust or something else. So that's the next two plays. Okay. Then we have the blades coming together in such a way that again, the points are up out of the way. You're not going to get hit, but again, you're not quite free just to leave the blade and strike. So you kick them in the nuts so their cover will falter, as the text says, right? And then the next play after that, after the crossing or even before the crossing, the context isn't entirely clear. There's a cut to the leg and you slip the leg and you strike him in the head. Okay. So he's going through the various possibilities of what can happen when these two blows come together. Right. I can keep going on this for the next hour. And, right. And but this is your interview. So let's.
I appreciate all of that, but that's not what I meant. But what I meant was that instead of going for this kind of that you show the guards and then you do something with the guards, organize them according to the guards. Yeah. That's not what's happening there. No, like I said before, he has organized his material. There is no doubt about that. I mean, obviously, as you say, it's. So that's not the point. But still, you can sort of catch these different ideas of how to write fight books underneath there. Yeah,
it's an entirely fair question as to why he would. Have these guards of the poleaxe, guards of the sword and armor, guards of the spear. Why would he include those when they're really not necessary? Right? Yeah. Maybe it's because this is how we present the fight book.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, it's his source material because there existed fight books. He refers to existing fight books. So he's probably, making the best use of this corpus of imagery.
Does he refer to existing fight books?
Well, he mentions that one of his students owns fight books.
What owns books?
Fight books. Well, yeah, books. Yeah. I mean,
and he says no one can master the art without books.
Yeah.
But I think it's. I would absolutely dearly love it if there was a bibliography at the back of Fiore where he says, and you should check out these works by other masters such as, and then a nice little list of manuscripts we can go and hunt down in libraries. But it's, I mean, I would love it if we could find solid evidence of a library of fight books that existed in the 14th century.
I suppose there is a lot of lost material that's now lost to us because this kind of stuff obviously hasn't attracted that much interest because, I mean, what are you going to do with it? Because the widely held belief seems to have been that this is not something you can even, intellectually teach to people. So even Fiore has to justify, that you can't be, even his student says that you can't be a good student of this art if you don't own books. Yeah. So why would you make this point if it were obvious to everybody? Because obviously it's not. And this is something that we find, all the way to the 19th century bayonet combat is the same idea that this is not something, personal combat is not something you can teach people. And then, well, in antiquity as well, we've got in Xenophon's Syropaideia, we've got this passage where it is implied that anybody can fight with sword and shield, because we all, since we are children, we pick up sticks and we know how to poke things with them. And if somebody hits us, we know how to raise our left hand to defend. So if we fight our enemy with swords and shields, they have no advantage over us because everybody has equal opportunity, so to speak.
Except literally every successful army in the world trains its soldiers.
Yes, of course. Yes, but train in what? Do they train them in interpersonal combat, or do they train them in all the other stuff like, keeping formation, marching with discipline to actually meet the enemy and so forth? So this is actually a very interesting question, which is not that straightforward, and we can get back to that later on, because it's,
it's an interesting thought that, according to Xenophon, basically I've wasted my life trying to teach people skills that can't be taught.
Well, you can be happy that Aristotle disagreed with him.
Well, honestly, I would say Aristotle over Xenophon any day. Brilliant.
Yeah, but this to some extent it's probably that people are talking about different things that, it's always when you say that you can't learn sword fighting from a book. Well, obviously you can't read a book and then you can go and do sword fighting. But I suppose you can read a book and pick up the exercises, do them with a partner, train with a partner, and then you will have gained some sort of skill. So you could say that, yes, I learned this from a book as opposed to somebody teaching me. But still, you did not gain that skill from the book. You gained that from practice. And this is something that on the level of discourse gets muddled up very easily when people talk about this.
Yeah, it comes down to the difference between semantic knowledge and procedural knowledge. Right. So the book gives you the semantic knowledge that this is a sword and this is what you do with it.
And this is exactly the kind of thing that these fight books give us. They sort of they can give some pointers, like, okay, yes, you should point the sword at the enemy at all times, and you should not hit his weapon, but you should hit against his openings and so forth, which are all very nice, and you can actually use them in your exercises when you do something and you're trying to figure out, well, what am I doing wrong? Okay, then I go through these precepts and, oh yes, I'm actually not following that one. So again, you get something out of that. So you can use this kind of stuff, but you need to apply it to actually embody it. Right,
exactly. And, I make a large chunk of my living from writing books to teach people how to fight with swords. So I agree entirely. You can't learn sword fighting from just reading a book. But you absolutely can and do learn it from reading a book and applying the exercises therein. It's that translation from semantic to procedural knowledge, which is the trick.
The only thing is, of course, that you can learn some things from other people's bodies when you are in actual contact with them. Even if it's through a sword or something, when you move and they react, and then you learn things from them. So that's something you can't get if you don't have a live teacher. But all the other stuff.
No, you can. You can. You don't learn. And I speak as a historical martial arts instructor. This has been my job for over 20 years. And I shouldn't say this because it's bad for business. You don't learn swordsmanship from the teacher. You learn it from the person you're crossing swords with, right? So the teacher's job is to make sure that the person you're crossing swords with is doing what they need to do so that you can learn what you need to learn.
Of course. That's when we're talking about good teachers and stuff like that. But I mean, when you got these expert practitioners who can't really explain anything, or they just sort of want to show you, and then when you do stuff with them and you sort of get the feeling that, okay, now I'm sort of getting what he's doing, and now I have this feeling that, okay, this is what works, and you can't really put it to words in a way. So it becomes this kind of silent knowledge that apparently gets passed from their body to yours. I mean, not to sound too esoteric about it, but this is just the kind of knowledge that I was referring to. I mean,
and you're not wrong, because when you watch somebody who's really good at what they're doing, when you watch them move, your mirror neurons fire up, and one way of learning movement is to copy the movement by basically recreating through movement the feeling you get by watching the movement. So it communicates that way.
And of course, sometimes it's a very interesting question of what kind of detail can you put into writing in a meaningful way. And I do like this idea of what do you call it? This constraint-based learning. So you've got so you can sort of freely do what you want, but you've got these constraints within which you must operate, and then you sort of adapt to the best method your body is able to come up with. And in a way, I like to use like LXXIX glosses to Lichtenauer's Zornhau as an example, because it kind of fits with this idea that, okay, the opponent cuts at you from their right shoulder. And what do? You also cut at them from your right shoulder without parrying. So that's one constraint. You are cutting at them, you're not parrying. And obviously, well, you need to cut them in some way that their cut doesn't hit you. So you can already know when your exercise fails if you do this. If they hit you, you did it wrong, and you just sort of try to find, okay, now I know how to cut them without them cutting me or hitting me. And it's not a parry, because the next movement is, then I threaten them with the point. So that's another constraint. You should be able to immediately thrust after this countercut. So you've got these constraints that is not a parry, it's a cut, and it should end up so that you are threatening them with a point. So using these pointers, you can sort of construct this technique that is similar enough to what they meant.
Although the way that it's done, that actually works, suggests to me that the word that is being translated as parry does not mean parry the way we what the way we mean when we say parry.
Yeah, I mean,
because you're putting your sword in the way of their sword.
Yes,
but you're not aiming a strike at their sword. Right? You're aiming it at them, but your sword is getting in the way of theirs. And for your point to be free to strike immediately, you can't actually hit them with the cut.
Yeah, that's. I mean, obviously you can't. If both hit each other in the same way, then it's just very symmetrical.
So you're doing so you're doing a blow that closes the line of the incoming attack, and places your point in line to strike. By any reasonable definition of the way we use the term parry now, it's a parry. It is. But the way, what they mean when they say parry back in, I mean, certainly in Fiore, I'm not an expert on the Lichtenau now stuff at all, but when Fiore is using the word, the closest word he uses to parry would be rebattere, which is to beat aside. And in that case, my blow would be cutting your weapon out of the way, and then I'd be striking. And so I think Lichtenau is explicitly saying, like, don't cut the weapon out of the way. Make this cut that ends in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what everybody means when they say parry in the because I suppose any defense can be called a parry to some extent. And that is pretty much the original meaning, I suppose. But in this case, this versetzen is what I think is meant in this in Lichtenauer's glosses and stuff is that there is this kind of when you look at when they talk about if the opponent performs a versetzen, so it's always sort of about them going too much to the side or not being in line and so forth. So that's probably what it means, that it's more like something, as you say, something that you shouldn't be doing for various reasons. So it's exactly this. So you shouldn't be simply putting your sword or trying to hit their sword out of the way, but instead cut in a way that, as you just put it very beautifully. But my point is still this, that these texts do include these kind of very useful pointers for creating technique sometimes, and it's something that is certainly worth looking at. But then at other times they just don't provide details like this. Yeah,
true. Okay, now I'm keenly aware that we're nearly 40 minutes in, and I've only asked you 3 out of my 9 questions. So I'm just going to jump to the next question, which was actually sent to me by Cornelius Berthold, who's been on the show before. Actually, we discussed tempo in great depth and detail. So he says, you meticulously analyze both image and especially the text, but when trying to make sense of the content over the course of the book, you more and more base your arguments on a practical interpretation of the actual fighting techniques. This makes sense on the one hand, but on the other one is a slippery slope, as you can imagine. How did you try to separate the evidence from the book from your own martial arts experience that naturally colors your interpretation of what techniques are being described? It's good question, isn't it?
Yeah, that is a very pertinent question, and I think we already covered some of those topics. Actually,
we did. Yeah.
But of course, this is always a problem. This researchers' bias, and it also goes for languages, because the way you read, for example, an ancient language, it always has to do with what kind of texts have you read before, and what kind of dictionaries you happen to be using, and so forth. So there's always this kind of bias of interpretation based on that. And when it comes to body technique, it's even more. It has even more to do with how you are used to using your body. And but still, one interesting thing is that at my defense, my opponent was actually worried of the opposite thing. He asked me if I had actually worked through it sword in hand.
Oh, really?
So I mean.
Who was your opponent?
Daniel Jacquet.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
I cannot think of a better person to be your opponent.
Yeah. It was very, very nice. But so obviously people can read it in more than one way.
Sure.
But this is something I did give a lot of consideration to. And of course, what I try most not to do is to identify any of the movements that I see described in texts as something, as the same as something that I know from somewhere else. And to be quite honest, I don't I don't, for this very reason, I mean, I have, of course, I mean, I have played through 133 several times, and I've done things based on 133, but I sort of stopped doing that at some point, and I thought that it's simply better to sort of try to stay on the level of what is actually said in the text and how that fits with what is said elsewhere, and sort of use these different discourses to kind of try to create some kind of explanation for why they write the things they write. So sometimes I suppose one could argue that my own lack of talent comes in the way. For example, when I say that grabbing the opponent's buckler with your right hand is a complicated movement. Well, maybe somebody will come and say that it's actually not a complicated movement. I can do it at tournaments or something.
Who knows? I don't think it's complicated.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's not complicated to do as a movement. I mean, I can show it to people, but performing it against somebody who is actually fencing against you or something.
You have to be really mentally prepared to let go of your own sword. That's the hard bit.
Yeah, of course. But anyway, that's just an example actually, which I use to underline the fact that some movements seem to be obviously less. Some recurring movements in sword and buckler sources seem to be less basic than others. So
absolutely.
This is obviously something that's included, not because it's something that people just kept doing all the time when they were sword and buckler fencing with each other. Or who knows? I mean, maybe they did. But still, it seems like something that would happen less often, but would be included because it was kind of felt to be the sign of a complete text or complete work on sword and buckler or something.
Yeah, but, and the priest explicitly contrasts what he does with the common fencing. So one can reasonably expect that he's a bit more sophisticated, or at least thinks he is.
Yeah. I mean, the way I read these captions is kind of that whatever this book contains was considered to be, or these images, what they contain was considered something rather extraordinary, which is the reason they were recorded in the first place, which is the reason they were commented on with these captions and so forth. So yes, of course, this book does contain something that not everybody was doing at the time.
Yeah. So actually, just a sort of quick sidebar. Why do you think the book was written? What was it for?
Well,
it's expensive.
Oh, not sure how expensive this particular book would have been, but yeah, I mean, to record this stuff for posterity, maybe to set up, like something of a tradition, or act as a collective memory for remembering how these things should be done or something. Because obviously, if you are teaching the art, you need to teach it in a live teaching situation, but.
Sure.
But this kind of it's sort of like part of this intellectual efforts of the time to make sense of everything. So in a way, it just fits with that. I mean, why do we now write books about things? It's not
true.
that different from that, maybe.
So who do you think it was written for?
I can't remember if I've ventured any idea on that, so I'm not going to. I will pass on this one. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So shall we say insufficient evidence to make a declarative statement?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that.
That's a much more academic way of saying pass.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's the thing, I don't like speculating much, so it's
fair.
Yeah.
No, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I was just because it's one thing that's always sort of bugged me, like where we have a dedicatee for a book.
Yeah.
The Duke of Urbino, for instance, or Nicola d'Este, or whoever else. Then there's at least an audience of one, and you can imagine. Yep. Yeah, but okay. In the author's mind, there is
somebody they wanted to associate.
Yes.
Yeah. Not an audience as per se, perhaps.
No, but there's like in the Getty manuscript at least there are references to the Marquis within the book, like when he's putting poison dust out of the poleaxe in his face. He says, Signora mio Marchese, so like, my gracious lord sort of thing. I know you would never do this sort of thing, but I include the rest. I include this here just for the sake of knowledge, right? So he's addressing the Marquis within the book, and so you can say, well, the Marquis may never have actually seen the book, but in the author's head, that's the kind of audience he's writing it for, right? And there isn't any such thing in 133.
Yeah, there is no prologue or anything, so it's really hard to say.
And it doesn't.
What the point was.
It doesn't look like a presentation.
No.
It looks more like well, it's not a house book either. It's clearly a treatise of this one particular topic.
Which has been then corrected and some changes. Sure.
So I'm just wondering. I mean, maybe he had a student who he had in mind when he was writing.
Yeah, or maybe they were setting up a martial arts school. Who knows?
That's probably close to it. All right. Okay. Now we're going to leave 133 aside for a minute because I do have some other very important questions I have to ask you. And the first one is, what are you currently working on?
Currently, I'm working on Konrad Kiese's Belli Fortis, which is slightly later than 133. But it's interesting because the poetic form of 133 is similarly incompetent as that of Belli Fortis, and of course the material of Belli Fortis is related in the sense that it deals with technology for war and all kinds of recipes and alchemy and astronomy and these kind of interesting topics. But what I intend to get done is a critical edition of the text and or a scientific edition of the text and translation, of course, and a commentary, plus some work on his sources and his the way the poetry is composed.
Okay, fantastic. So when will we expect that to come out?
That depends entirely on if I can get this whole project funded, so I can actually finish it.
Okay, right. Fingers crossed that the grant-giving bodies are merciful.
Yes, thank you.
Actually, are you planning on producing your PhD as a book or two books?
Yes, it was suggested that I should aim for two separate books, one on 33 and the other on fight books more generally. And this is something that I'm pursuing at the moment, actually. Yeah,
because I would love to see those as publishable books. Okay, I have a very specific question for you. What might one find in the Greek papyri of pragmatic literature on combat technique? Let me give you the reference. P.Oxy.3466 and LXXIX 5204.
Oh, well, that is the title of an article I wrote on this topic. So if one Googles that, then they
Where do you think I got the idea from?
If one Googles that, then they will definitely find my article. But, yes, obviously this goes for the this is for the more ancient history of fight books. These are these two papyri fragments are the most ancient fight book fragments, if you will, that we actually have. They are both from the 2nd century, preserved in Roman Egypt, and they have been published in the papyri of Oxyrhynchus as numbers 466 and 5204 in 1903 and 2014. So the first one, number 466, that's fairly well known. Much has been written about it, and the second one was published slightly later, so it hasn't been discussed that much.
Fairly well known in certain circles, but I'm guessing most of my listeners have never heard of it. So if you just expand a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah. So it's a fragment from a book on wrestling or grappling. Written in a nice bookhand, so it seems to have been a commercial book. And it's basically what we have are sequences of moves written in the form of commands, well, supposedly given by the instructor to their students. And one of the better preserved sequences goes something like, you put your arm around, you grab under it, you step across and tangle. And at the end. So we can't really make much of, ancient Greek wrestling out of that, because there are resources for looking into what these terms actually mean, and Michael Polyakov's books are a great place to start for that. And what I did, I wasn't trying to give any technical interpretation of these this fragment. But instead, what I was interested in was what do these two fragments, the other is actually so fragmentary that the only thing it can sort of tell us is that it seems to match this form of the other one. So it also appears to be made up of commands and sequences. But this seems to establish the fact that there was a genre of wrestling manuals in existence, and they were something that people would have read at the time, because obviously wrestling was hugely popular in the Greek-speaking world, and also later on in the whole Greco-Roman world, I suppose. This kind of gives us the first glimpse into what a fight book could look like. And what I find sort of interesting there is that it's only references to what we have. It's only references to techniques that the reader and the listener of the commands are supposed to know, of course. Okay? So it's not like technical descriptions, but it just gives you a sequence that you can sort of perform for. Yeah.
It reminds me, from what you just said, it reminds me of like the late 19th century sort of cutlass or bayonet manuals, where
bayonet manuals,
the instructor says, line A goes into this position, line B does this attack, and these are the commands that are given.
And so this is and also like the way you write down classical fencing lessons. Sometimes you can also give them as commands. So in one way, this seems to be like the most. If you think of what would be the simplest way of writing down or depicting fighting technique in a way that you can sort of put on papyrus or whatever writing surface. So you can write down what the teacher would say, or you can draw pictures showing the throws or the grips or whatever. And we find both of these in the ancient Greek world. We've got these vase paintings, showing wrestling moves, and we've got these wonderful fragments that give us lists of commands in the form as if they were given by a wrestling instructor. So this is kind of, you could think that this is the most naturalistic way of doing it or something, kind of like just writing down life teaching. But then again, as you say, these lists of commands are also given later on in the 19th century, which for slightly different reasons. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like primitive in a bad sense or anything.
No.
But of course, there is so little material that you can't really say much about it, unfortunately. But still, it's very interesting stuff. And of course, I would love to see if there ever was like a film set in Roman Egypt and they wanted to show wrestling. It would be great, if they just used this.
An instructor saying.
It would be really great. But I mean, I don't think that you can't really make more than educated guesses on how to actually play out this sequence.
I've just had a brilliant idea, right? Okay, about 7 or 8 years ago, I did a April Fool's joke on the entire historical martial arts world because I fabricated a falchion treatise in Italian in manuscript form, and I published it on April the 1st, and then revealed that it was actually a complete fabrication, right? Because it was, and honestly, okay, I absolved myself of any naughtiness because at the end there's a picture of the falchion, and it's the Medici falchion from the Wallace collection, really clearly and obviously a mid-16th century falchion in a 14th century manuscript. So, it's like making the characters wear wristwatches. Okay. So, but it was hysterical. And the funniest bit was when people got a bit sniffy about having been taken in by it. And said, well, yes, and of course I knew from this bit here that from the grammar and whatnot that it couldn't possibly be 14th century. And it's like, yes, but actually I took that verbatim from one of Fiore's manuscripts. So, I think the grammar's about right. But anyway, I digress. Some people can take a joke, some people can't.
Yeah,
but wouldn't it be awesome to get some papyrus, copy some wrestling images from vases onto the papyrus with these Greek instructions underneath, age it with like tea and stick it in the oven or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, You probably wouldn't fool anyone.
No. The objective isn't to seriously fool anyone. I think though, actually, we would fool almost everyone in historical martial arts because most of them don't know anything about the early classical stuff, right? And they can't read Greek. I can't read Greek.
There isn't much to know about, honestly. But
exactly.
It
would be extremely funny.
But yeah, I mean to get back to this wonderful grappling fragment. So one more interesting thing is, of course, that they sort of these what I just called sequences. They are kind of like what people now call plays or stycke or something. So in that sense, the way to conceptualize fighting technique in form of such sequences seems to be like the most ancient thing we know of.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah. This and of course it didn't escape the Greeks that wrestling is with these bodies entwined together and so forth. So has some erotic connotations as well. And these are the sources where we also know, or where we have like corroborating evidence that this is how wrestling instruction was given, because we have some erotic epigrams that sort of indirectly show situations like this, where one is giving commands to the other to do certain things. And there is this one erotic story where there is a lady who says that she will act as the wrestling coach, and she will start giving this man instructions, and then he has to grab her by the thighs and to throw her on her back and so forth. So this is indirect evidence, but it kind of corroborates the form that these papyri display, which is kind of interesting.
So I do have a note here to ask you about ancient Greek sex manual.
Oh yes, well, hopefully not just ancient Greeks, but ancient sex manuals. Yes, this is something that I've also been pursuing lately, because it sort of relates to this topic of body technique and how body technique is communicated in writing and text and image. So, well, I mean, what we have is, of course, people would most likely be familiar with the name Ovid, who wrote Art of Love, which is about seduction and how you get to meet girls and what you need to say to them and so forth. And it also has a very short section on sexual positions that lists a few positions and which position is the most suitable for which body type and this kind of thing, mostly on like aesthetic grounds. So he's different from Lucretius there, who actually says that more ferarum, which is the manner of beasts, or the way you do it on the Discovery Channel, so to speak, is the best, because that's best for procreation, and anything else is just bad because it defeats that aim. But Ovid talks about what looks the best, what is aesthetically more pleasing or exciting, and so forth. But Ovid was also not writing in a vacuum. I mean, his work was not the only. He didn't invent the genre of ancient love manuals or anything. So before him, we have a few names and references to earlier existing literature. One name that pops up is Elephantis. It's like I'm going to skip some of the details, some of the stuff that has been written about what do these names actually refer to. Are they just pseudonyms of men who are actually writing these books, or are they just generic prostitute names or something? I mean, that's not interesting at the moment. But we have these references in classical or ancient poetry of Elephantis' books being used as models, or her pictures being used as models. And for example, Suetonius tells us of the Emperor Tiberius having had her books and paintings in his several bedchambers, so in his private island, in his infamous sex caves, so that nobody.
I have a new life goal. I need to have a private island with an infamous sex cave.
Yes,
that's what I want. That's my life ambition right there.
Yeah, and his Tiberius is. There is this one film, Caligula, with Malcolm McDowell and Peter O'Toole as Tiberius, which probably gives a very accurate depiction thereof. But anyway, Suetonius says that he had these pictures in these bedchambers so that nobody would lack a model to perform if they needed to perform any of the ordered positions.
Wow!
So we have these very clear indications that these images from Elephantis' books were used as models. So sort of communicating technical knowledge, how to perform a certain position.
So he had these sex manuals in his infamous sex cave in exactly the same way that I have the treatise of the day open on a lectern. So when my students are training, they can see the book.
Yes, it is exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Wow.
So then another author is Philaenis. She probably lived earlier. She probably lived in the 4th century BCE. And she apparently also authored a work of similar nature, which is referred to in similar ways and also used as a model. And this is something that we actually have a fragment of again, in the Oxyrhynchus papyri, number 2891. Unfortunately, this fragment doesn't include any actual positions or anything like that, but it has the beginning of a section. It indicates the author, who is named as Philaenis Ogymenous Samia, and so it includes the start of a section on seduction, and then it ends with the title on kissing. So these are the kind of topics that we also encounter in Ovid. So it's very good reason to assume that Ovid's work is somehow kind of inspired by Philaenis' work. So, but unfortunately, this doesn't actually corroborate the fact that she would have discussed or depicted these different positions in any detail. But still, yeah, it's kind of like the wrestling manual, that we've got this fragment that doesn't really tell us much, but tells us enough so that several articles have already been written on it, and much academic ink has been spilled on it.
So it strikes me as interesting that it's a truism that every technology eventually gets used for violence and for sex, right? And like here we have like several thousand-year-old sources, which writing relatively new, writing on paper. I mean, not really new, but it's early days of writing, should we put it that way? And they're writing about how to do sex better and how to do violence better. It's fantastic.
Yeah, these topics sort of go hand in hand. They are both themes that are at different times in different culture. They are very much part of everybody's everyday lives, and sometimes they are more taboos and so forth. But yes, definitely. And also one interesting thing is that I do think that the way they sort of conceptualized sex in terms of these positions is the kind of same way they conceptualized wrestling in terms of these sequences, because they actually use the same words, schema, for both of them.
Okay.
And interestingly, there is this one ancient rhetorician, Isocrates, who lived in the 4th century BCE, and he actually wrote that if you want to train a speaker, you teach them just the same way as you train wrestlers. You teach them first all the schemes or the figures of wrestling, what would be the correct word, the schemata, the figures, and then after they've learned all the figures, they get to apply them freely.
Right.
And it goes that way. So it goes from wrestling to speaking or thinking properly, like arguing logically and so forth. So again, I mean, we talked about earlier how you first have the guards and then you sort of have the sequences based on those guards. But I wouldn't go as far as seeing a link here necessarily at this point. But it's sort of an intriguing idea that you've got these school things like set figures, and then you apply them. which is like a very basic idea in many martial arts even today.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. Here are the forms. Now go play.
Yeah. And these sex positions, by the way, they are just called figures in Latin and Greek as well. So it's kind of like there are these similarities, so not only that this is a way of communicating technique, but also how they sort of think of this way of communicating technique. So it's this all ties together very nicely.
Yeah, like they're answering the fundamental problem. Here is a skill.
Yeah.
And here are the sort of the theories and like the propositions that it's related to. And again, how do you get from this propositional semantic knowledge to procedural knowledge or skill?
Yes, and Isocrates actually says that there are so many. There is like an infinite number of different situations that can come across in the real world. So you can't have theory for all of them. You can't have like specific set theories for all of them. So if you know good figures and have trained in them, then you can figure out most of them. Yeah. So his thoughts, like 2,400 years ago, 2,300 years ago, it's pretty much topical.
Bang on.
I think. Yeah. I mean, nothing new under the sun. Why are we doing all this?
Well, why wouldn't we?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Now, I see over your right shoulder a bayonet trainer leaning against the wall.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And we've mentioned bayonet stuff a little earlier. So what are your thoughts?
Oh, yes. The bayonet combat or bayonet fencing is something that I've been pursuing for some years as something of a side project. And it also ties neatly with all these topics that we've been discussing. And also it's a very interesting phenomenon in European martial or combat arts, because it is something that came to be at the turn of the 19th century and existed for a relatively short time, and then it turned into something else that is, we still have bayonet combat, we still have people training the use of bayonets, but that is actually a slightly, I would argue that that's something different. It's not this thing that I'm mainly interested in, because it has become more this pugilistic boxing kind of thing, not bayonet fencing, using bayonet rifle as you would use like a fencing sword.
Right.
And I think, we talked about earlier how you can't. So there have been in history several people who think that you can't really teach like interpersonal combat to anybody, because it's like this intellectual thing. It depends on the intelligence of the person, and you can't teach that. You can teach people to load a musket because it's just mechanical movements. You can show them to them. You can make pictures of them, like in these drill books. You can just give picture series and have people do them, and you can see that they do it properly. So that is a skill that can be taught, and then you can tell them to fire, and that's it, basically. But you can't teach these complex skills, like you can't really teach anybody to win battles, if you know what I mean. I mean, you can teach, you can sort of give them education and hope they will be good officers or generals. But this is also a very, now I'm sidetracking slightly, but this is also a relatively new phenomenon, that you would actually have schools for officers where you teach them to do their job, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's also like an late 18th century idea, basically. But so this is the idea that also permeated the scene of bayonet fencing. And even though, like after the 30 Years' War, people somewhere started putting their daggers in their muskets, and then they call them bayonets, and people started using bayonets instead of pikes in the early 18th century. This doesn't mean that people were training bayonet fencing at the time.
No.
And the way they first held the bayonets was like how you hold a pike in the field position, that you have the rear arm straight and the front arm sort of vertical, and the pike is just lying there, and you walk forward with that. When you what do you call it in English? You don't fell the pike. You charge the pike. Yes, you charge the pike against infantry. So they would have the bayonet, the musket with the bayonet in more or less the same position, which was rather awkward. And in 1753, actually, the Prussian army changed the grip into what you now think of when you think of a bayonet combat grip, that you hold it like normally, as if you could be also firing it from more or less the same position.
Oh, interesting.
And around this time also, in actually 1762, there was this one French officer who was working as an officer in the Prussian army, who was commenting on Maurice of Saxony's book, and he wondered there, why don't we teach our soldiers to use the bayonets the same way we teach them to fence? Because with the feints and parries and so forth, because this wasn't something that they were doing at the time.
Right.
And there is also one, I remember one English manual where it simply says that you don't, in drills, you don't need a command for the thrust, because, everybody will know when to thrust, because when the enemy is there, you thrust and you can't miss with that, so it's not something you would train or anything. And speaking of the English, of course, in the British Army did experiment with techniques of bayonet fencing. Anthony Gordon's name is famous enough, I suppose, because his book was published in 1805, which is on fencing and also bayonet combat.
I'm loving this. Hang on a second. All right. The people who may have heard of the Greek stuff are almost certainly will never have heard of the Gordon stuff from 1805, and vice versa. So yeah, so just give a little bit of context.
Okay. There isn't much to say about Anthony Gordon's. I think Hutton said that he's just a weird curiosity or something. But he did develop a bayonet fighting system, and he tried to sort of introduce it to the British Army, but he was rejected in the 1790s, I think. But he still published it in his book in 1805, and he claims that it's a scientific method because the way he puts them. The way he lines up the men is that every time when you charge bayonets, sort of two guys, the guys in the back step forward, so you always have two guys against one of the enemy, and so this is scientific, and you will always beat your enemy. And he also introduced the concepts of fort and foible to the game. So he certainly thought that he had come up with something very clever, but the British Army didn't think so. And in the 1830s, the British Army were experimenting with at least three other systems as well by Major MacArthur, about whom I know very little, and the system of Henry Angelo, the grandson of Domenico Angelos, and also an English translation of the Swedish system developed by Per Henrik Ling. And they rejected them all because they are too complex, the command words are too long and hard to understand, and the exercises are too strenuous, and people will get hernia from doing them, and soldiers' gear is too heavy, they can't do these fancy movements in the field. And also the British soldier already knows how to use their rifle, and taking away their free time to introduce new exercises is pointless. So the British Army only...
that sounds so very British.
yes, and the British Army actually eventually, and this is it's a kind of, you could say that the first time they were at war with a nation who was actually doing bayonet fencing. I'm not saying this is the reason, but in the Crimean War. After the Crimean War, the British Army did adopt Henry Angelo's system as an official training curriculum, but even that is not really like a bayonet fencing system. No. It's like these different thrusts in different directions, and so it's nothing as complex and as the complete Swedish system or the Saxon system, which actually I think they also tried out, but it was too strenuous with all the jumping and one-handed thrust and stuff like that. But yeah, so, and then later on, of course, Alfred Hutton did write his books, and he was sort of looking into all the stuff and wanted to come up with a good system of bayonet fencing. And he actually also came up with something that is quite close to the modern kind of like what I like to call bayonet boxing with what he called it butt fencing, which is very accurate. You use the rifle butt and the bayonet as well. Yeah, but that's kind of a different way of moving your body, and this is something that becomes popular after the Second World War, and also in Finland. So it was so it's like the new wave of bayonet fencing. But anyway, of course, bayonet fencing sort of came to be independently as parallel development in several places at the turn of the 19th century. But one name sort of sticks out, and that is Eduard von Selbnitz, a Saxon captain who was stationed in France for some time, and he learned fencing, thrust or foil fencing in Germany, I think, and he also learned the Italian style and the French style from Joseph Pinet, who was later also known as the originator of the French system of bayonet, even though his and Selbnitz's systems are not really related in any way. But Selbnitz sort of, yes, he also learned from a French sailor, or some sources actually say it was an American sailor. I'm not sure about that. I need to look into it. But he learned from a sailor this system of fighting with the baton. So with a stick or a staff.
Yeah.
So and then he put all these things he had learned together and created this perfect system of bayonet fencing against cavalry and against infantry. And sometime later he was a very sought after teacher, and officers from other regiments and armies would come to him to learn this system, and it basically spread to the other German nations.
So do you think it was actually? So it was good, was it?
Well, it must have been. They must have thought it was good for whatever purpose they thought they were training it for. Yeah, because it's a very good exercise. I mean, I love doing the warm-up drills and everything. It's very nice stuff to do, and it's like the German commentators say, it sort of obeys the rules of fencing. Right. Unlike, for example, the Swedish system. So yeah, this Selbnitz, he's something of a Lichtenauer of the 19th century German bayonet scene, I would say. Okay. And some regulations came out at the time which were pretty much based on his teachings, and he also managed to get a book self-published, crowd-funded self-published book out in 1825.
Wow.
Part 1 only, which is only about against cavalry. So he never got to writing his own book on against infantry. So whatever he taught against infantry, you have to sort of piece together from the other regulations and military journals, and all these commentaries on his teachings that exists elsewhere. But yeah, it also came out later as a second edition. But it's a very nice book with very beautiful engravings showing the different positions and movements.
So what do you actually practice?
Well, I do practice this Selbnitz's system and the Swedish system. The Swedish system is actually something that for a long time I felt that I knew it the best, because there are Per Henrik Ling's own writings, the regulation he wrote in 1836, and his commentaries, his replies to critics, for example, because there were many there were many critics who said that you can't actually the thrust, because he didn't use the lunge. He thought that the Swedish body type was not good for lunging, and it's a difficult, not good for jumping. The Nordic body type is not good for jumping, and lunges are too difficult to teach. You can't teach a proper lunge, and he also makes a very interesting claim that you don't need a lunge in bayonet fencing, because the only reason you use the lunge is to move forward, and you can move forward by taking a step. And the second reason is that you get power when you do the lunge. But with the bayonet rifle, you don't need power because it's so heavy. Ergo, you don't need the lunge.
He's not wrong.
Well, he's ignoring speed, I suppose, but I mean, that's yeah. So this was his argument, and he only has walking steps or passing steps, because that was something that they were already taught in their basic training. So since the soldiers would know how to walk at that point, hopefully. I mean, this was not something that you could take for granted, because at the time, if you've worked your whole life at a field or something, you are not ergonomically necessarily like ready to walk or stand properly. So this was one of the reasons they came up with military gymnastics in the first place. But yeah, so it's very interesting reading about his arguments and his responses to his critics, because that kind of gives you more than just a regulation where he describes the movements and so forth. So you really get to these details and why you have to have the weight on the rear foot, because you need to concentrate. You don't want eccentric force, you want concentrated force or something. So and he gets sometimes a bit philosophical as well. And he's actually, I should mention that his influence is very far-reaching. The Swedish gymnastics or what that he developed were sort of practiced all over and became like a huge thing. And he's also the reason we call classical. He's also the reason we call classical massage Swedish massage. But
So he's the guy who developed the calisthenics that basically then also got adopted by the yogis in India into something that they could teach back to the Europeans.
Yeah. This he ties into all this as well. Yeah.
Wow.
But his bayonet fencing is interesting, and his fencing system as well. And
I knew of his calisthenic stuff. I didn't know about his bayonet stuff at all.
And then because this system of his was actually adopted by the Prussian army. Around in the 1840s, and the German short average German manual was published at the time, and of course that was also met with a lot of criticism because the Prussians didn't like the Swedish system. So you get a lot of information not only from the books themselves but from the prefaces and the forward when they sort of respond to different points that people have brought up and so forth. So the Swedish Prussian system is very well documented, very widely documented, and that is something that I kind of actively practiced and also taught to my group of students or some unfortunate people whom I exposed to my experiments, so to speak. But then the other system I do mostly is the Selnitz one, the Saxon system, and I'm sort of trying to piece together from all these Saxon-inspired sources what Selnitz actually taught against infantry.
Fantastic.
Because there's so much similar to like modern martial arts discourse in all this, because you know this, that which is the best art. This was like something. This was
that whole stupid thing.
This was a very very heated topic. And there was the Danish school, which was somewhat independent, and the Saxon school, and the Swedish school, and the French school. So one group of Prussian officers, they actually wrote a book where they criticized this Swedish system and came up with their sort of idea of what the Prussian system should be like. And then and then later on, of course, the Prussians came up with their own regulation that was like a modified version of the Swedish system, and every new iteration of the Prussian regulation sort of brings it slightly closer to the Saxon system. So they bring back the one-handed thrust and the lunge and stuff like that.
A one-handed thrust with a rifle with a bayonet from that period, that is quite physically challenging.
Yeah, but that's what they did, except for the Swedes. And the so-called Danish thrust is like a slide that you just loosen up the front hand and you let the musket or the rifle slide through it. Yeah. And the Swedes would just thrust with both hands, and the Saxon thrust would be just letting go with the left altogether.
Which I think people need to kind of try that to get an idea of what kind of physical conditioning you need to be able to do that accurately. It's something I train it with spears and sticks and whatnot to be able to hold it by the wrong end and, strike accurately from far away. But it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and this is something that they did a lot of this training with this kind of stick that you would hold on shoulder level or a bit higher and twirl it backwards and forwards and over your head and so forth to make your wrists supple and strong. And this, I think, is actually the only part in Selnitz bayonet fencing that actually comes from these French baton practices, because I can't really see anything else in his system that couldn't be explained as a version of like foil fencing.
Okay.
With changing the details, of course, because you are holding a rifle and not a light sword. But and then they dropped that altogether at some point, because they thought that, okay, you can just do exercises with your weapon. So why would you need this set of sticks? Because you can just do rifle gymnastics, as they call them, I think. Yeah.
Brilliant.
And Selnitz, but Selnitz also, he was also proficient with the flail.
Wow.
And
that's a hard weapon.
Yeah, and in 1830 he did this huge demonstration or show in Dresden, and there he had his students perform fencing moves and stuff, and then he defended himself successfully against multiple opponents with his flail, and he also showed staff or stick fighting there, but
cool.
The report of that event it's not quite clear on whether the technique was significantly different from his bayonet fencing. And of course, the person who was writing this report wasn't really an expert on the topic, so it's a bit hard to piece together what kind of stuff his stick fighting actually was. But yeah,
it's fascinating. Now, I have a couple of questions that I ask all of my guests, all of them who consent to being asked these questions, because as you know, my guests get their questions in advance. So what is the best idea you haven't acted on yet?
Yes, all the good ideas I have hopefully acted on. So this is going to be one of the worst ones. No, but I mean, one thing that I'm thinking of acting on at some point is to sort of draw up a research plan on more generally ancient or Greek military or martial education, looking at how this is done, not only in terms of these few fragments that we have of wrestling, which of course had a military significance as well, which we didn't talk about, but it is there.
Sure.
And you can look it up in the article, of course. But in Tertius's famous songs, where he's these so-called Spartan songs, where he sort of which were composed to sort of excite the men to battle and so forth, and also these works written on more like high level like siegecraft and stuff like that. So kind of bringing that together and trying to make some kind of maybe monograph out of that, or a few articles or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. No, that would be fascinating. So basically, we should be expecting a book from you at some point.
Well, I mean, I have so many things on my plate right now. So, and even you, there was this one idea earlier we talked about that I haven't also acted on yet. So regarding Giles of Rome. So
yes. Okay.
But, oh dear.
Okay, I'll tell you what you should do. Right. Just give me complete control of your diary for the next 10 years, and I promise you we will get at least 4 books out of you. Maybe not.
Well, it's also a matter of funds, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. Honestly, I think if it's pitched right, you wouldn't have any difficulty getting significant amounts of cash from the people who are likely to be interested to read the book. Because, I mean, like the Giles thing, for instance, if you're looking at the sword work and the footwork, if you stick to that, raising funds from the historical martial arts community to pay you to do that work and publish it should not be too hard, really. Because we're talking about low 5 figures. We're not talking about 6 figures or 7. So yeah, really, because it's fascinating.
Well, I mean, I'm glad to hear that it's fascinating.
And a bit of crowdfunding, maybe, that sort of thing. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I have no experience in such matters.
I've got lots.
Yes, I know.
Right, okay. And pretty much everything you suggested that you would like to do is something I would like to see done. So, obviously, after we've finished this episode off, if at some point you decide you would like to pursue something like this and you want any sort of advice or suggestions or help setting up the funding or the publishing or any of that kind of stuff, just ask. Seriously. Because I would like to see this stuff out in the world in the sort of form that people can just buy it and read it, because it would be good for the historical martial arts community as a whole. So count me in. Okay.
Oh, great.
But no pressure. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Okay. All right. My last question. Somebody gives you €1 million or similar large amount of cash to spend improving historical martial arts worldwide. How would you spend it?
Well, what we just talked about, well, I mean, but of course, I'll have to be boring here. I mean, what I would see as the most rational thing to do would be to set up a private foundation with a board of trustees that would just, give out yearly grants for research in the field of historical martial arts studies, whether philological or historical or material. So that would, in the long run, most likely benefit this thing the most.
Okay, so basically use it as an alternative to crowdfunding. So set up a
more traditional form of funding.
Okay, and so anyone who has a research proposal around historical martial arts should apply to the fund and get the money to go do the thing. Okay.
If there were such a thing, just to make clear.
Yeah, because this is what you would use the money to set up.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a fairly. You're not the first person on the show to suggest something like it.
Okay, I'm glad.
Because, people tend to go either towards the scholarships for people to travel to train, or scholarships or grants or whatever for people to do some kind of research or translation. Those are the two main things that people tend to go for. Okay. And is it difficult to get funding from current mainstream sources for academic work in this area? I've never tried, so I wouldn't know.
Well, I mean, I would have to say yes, but yes, and I'm working on that right now. So I don't want to jinx it by talking about it. Of course, this is where all academics get very superstitious. So
yes.
Of course, there are always less people, less money given out, and then there are people applying for it. So you can always say that it's difficult depending on funding decisions. But
so are you currently employed by the university?
No, I'm a grant researcher, so I'm working at the university, but with an outside grant. So that's rather typical. But in my opinion, of course, a very unfortunate arrangement that it's become so typical. But that's the situation here in Finland.
We could spend another hour and a half talking about how academia has totally fucked itself over the last 30 years. I did consider 20 odd years ago going into academia, and I just looked at it and I just couldn't get my head around the how much admin bullshit do you need to do to get one word of proper research done,
Yeah, of course, that is one of the best things when you are a grant-funded researcher, that you don't really have, necessarily you don't need to have many other responsibilities at the same time, at least. So.
No, but you do have to apply for these grants.
Yes, and all the other stuff, of course. So
Okay.
So you are you have the feeling that you are a bit of an outsider and so forth. So.
But as long as you don't have to go to faculty meetings, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I suppose so.
See,
I still get all the emails, though.
But I read somewhere that Stephen Hawking once attributed much of his academic success to the fact that due to his disabilities, he was never required to go to meetings.
Yeah.
So he could just do his research and teach his classes and write his papers, and that was that.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got a lot to think about now because, I have my readers, my students, or what have you, are effectively my grant giving body. And I absolutely know for a sure and certain fact that there are people listening right now who are going, I would throw money at this bloke to write that Greek thing. So I'm just gonna leave you with that thought. I can't help myself. I'm like, no, exciting, cool shit. Let's get it done.
Well,
I'm sorry. Yes, you shouldn't put a fin on the spot like that. It's not fair. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Antti. It's been lovely meeting you.
Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for listening. You can find the episode show notes at swordschool.com/podcast, where you will find transcriptions, photos, videos, and links for this episode. You can find a direct link to the show notes for this episode in the description. Join us next week for another cracking conversation. See you then.